We humans have a long, dark history of weaponizing fire. Long before any kind of machinery existed, armies resorted to completely wild and cruel tactics, like setting live pigs on fire and sending them running toward enemy lines just to cause panic, which, as you can imagine, worked. The first mechanical flamethrower showed up when the ancient Greeks mounted a hollowed-out tree trunk on a chariot and used giant bellows to blast burning pine resin and sulfur at enemy walls. Then the Byzantine Empire invented what became known as Greek fire, a highly secret liquid mixture that could even burn on water. It was sprayed from pressurized bronze tubes mounted on naval ships and was absolutely terrifying. The Chinese later advanced the concept with the pen huoqi, a mechanical pump system that could shoot a continuous, unbroken stream of flaming oil. But the technology didn't see any drastic change again until 1901, when a German engineer named Richard Fiedler designed the first modern pressurized military flamethrower. Then, in 1914, a German officer and, ironically, former fire chief named Bernhard Redermann figured out that high-pressure firefighting mechanics could be repurposed into a devastating weapon. And he actually went out and recruited civilian firefighters to do everything opposite to their original job and handle the heavy, dangerous hoses spraying fire, which directly set the stage for the horrors of trench warfare that were about to come. Now, the Germans developed two main types of flamethrower: a heavy static version that could hold hundreds of gallons of fuel, and a smaller portable version called the Flamethrowers. It had a large cylindrical steel tank worn on the back using a leather harness, and it held about 4 to 5 gallons of a thick fuel oil mixed with lighter petrol. To push the liquid out, it used highly compressed nitrogen gas. The thing could shoot flames about 60 feet, and a full tank gave you roughly 2 minutes of continuous fire, although soldiers were trained to fire in short bursts to conserve fuel. Now, this thing was too heavy and had too much recoil for one person to operate alone, so it had a crew of 3, one to carry the heavy tank, one to aim the lance, and a third soldier to protect the other 2, since the operators couldn't exactly defend themselves while standing there hosing fire at people. The first time the flamethrower was used in combat was in the Verdun sector. German troops sneaked up on French trenches before dawn and sprayed fire over them. The French quickly retook the ground, but the psychological effect was a huge success, or failure, depending on which side you were on. Soldiers dropped their rifles and ran in total panic to escape the suffocating smoke and flames. The Germans used it again, this time against inexperienced British troops. Attacking at dawn, they sprayed the trenches and followed up by throwing grenades. They caused 500 casualties in just a few hours and nearly wiped out an entire brigade just from the sheer panic the flamethrowers caused. So following these successes, the German command expanded the flamethrower unit to a full regiment, and they carried out over 600 localized flame attacks over the course of the war. Then, the British responded by creating their own flame-throwing weapon, but they went in a completely different direction. Instead of a backpack, they built the Livens Large Gallery Flame Projector, which was a massive 2.5-ton machine that was secretly assembled in underground tunnels right beneath no man's land. It could project streams of fire over 100 meters and was used during the Battle of the Somme when it incinerated a couple of German trenches. While the shocked survivors rather surrendered than risk being torched by these things they didn't even know were there. The British did also try to develop portable backpack versions, but they abandoned the idea because they were too heavy and had too short a range. There were also some very early experiments with mounting flamethrowers on tanks during World War I, but none of them were successful, as the tank itself was still evolving into something that could actually work. However, despite turning the tide of battle on a few occasions, actually operating a flamethrower was an incredibly dangerous job, as you might expect, and for several reasons. First, mobility was a nightmare. The operators had to walk through the shell-cratered mud, or stand up above the trench walls to fire, which made them huge, slow-moving targets. Allied soldiers would focus all their fire on the giant steel backpacks, hoping to blow them up. If the man carrying the tank was shot, or say, tripped and fell, the nozzle would be ripped from the other operator's hands, and the high-pressure hose would wildly whip around and set their own nearby troops on fire, which is what happened more than once. On top of that, a sudden gust of wind could blow the flames right back at the operators, which also killed several German flamethrower squads. And then there was the matter of the rules of war. The flamethrower was viewed as a sadistic terror weapon that caused unnecessary suffering, and because of that, violated the 1907 Hague Convention. So logically, Allied troops deeply hated flamethrower operators. If an operator surrendered or was captured, they were generally not treated as prisoners of war. They were executed on the spot if lucky enough to not be captured by the unit that had been under flamethrower attack by you or your fellows earlier. In that case, being shot would sound like a preferred option. And you know what I mean by that. US General John J. Pershing even issued a direct order that any captured German flamethrower operator was to be shot immediately. So, not exactly a job with great career prospects, and this was just the beginning of the story of the flamethrower. That was somehow only going to get worse. And don't worry, you're going to hear about that. After World War I, the flamethrower was seen as merely a specialized assault weapon and received almost no development during the interwar period. So by the time World War II was approaching, the Allies had very few models. There weren't any dedicated flamethrower units and little enthusiasm for the weapon overall. But when World War II began, the Germans, I'm sorry German viewers, but it was your ancestors again, brought the flamethrower back into heavy use as part of their blitzkrieg tactics. They also pioneered the first flame tanks, specifically the Flampanzer III, which replaced the standard main gun of a Panzer III with a flamethrower and saw some use on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union, in response, introduced tripwire-rigged flamethrower booby traps, famously used during the Battle of Stalingrad. And the Germans soon copied this idea to create their own defensive flamethrowers for protecting buildings. Now, the United States was initially lagging behind in flamethrower technology, but reports of German flame assaults forced American planners to rush new handheld designs into development. This led to the creation of the M1 flamethrower. It weighed 70 pounds and had those recognizable two main tanks holding 5 gallons of flammable mixture, propelled by a smaller central tank of compressed nitrogen gas. It had a maximum range of 20 to 40 yards depending on the conditions and provided 7 to 10 seconds of continuous fire. The M1 originally used a battery-powered electric ignition system, which was notoriously unreliable and was later replaced with a pyrotechnic system that used white phosphorus flares. However, early World War II flamethrowers had quite serious mechanical problems. For example, thin fuel oil and petrol mixtures burned out fast and didn't stick to targets well enough to be effective against deep, stubborn fortifications. So the US Chemical Warfare Service tried to fix this by thickening the gasoline with natural latex rubber. But then Japan's rapid conquest of Southeast Asia caused a catastrophic global rubber shortage. So to solve this, the US government launched a top-secret research program. And what they came up with was a new powder that could turn regular aviation gasoline and diesel into a thick, sticky gel that wouldn't break apart in the air like the old fuel mixtures did. It was made from two chemical compounds, naphthenic acid from crude oil and palmitic acid from coconut oil. And if you take parts of those two words, naphthenic and palmitic, you get the name that the world would come to know as napalm. Now, this new napalm fuel went straight into the upgraded American man-portable flamethrower, the M2. White phosphorus flares ignited the stream, which was a big improvement over those old, unreliable battery-powered igniters from the M1. But despite this upgrade, the M2 hadn't yet been used on any significant scale in the war. However, that was about to change. Before the American M2 flamethrower would become infamous, we have to mention how, over in Europe, the British developed the Churchill Crocodile. This was a tank built on the heavily armoured Mark 7 chassis that kept its 75mm main gun, but the hull machine gun was replaced with a flame projector, and the tank towed a huge 6.5-ton armoured trailer holding 400 gallons of napalm and nitrogen gas bottles, which gave it 80 seconds of firing time at ranges over 120 meters. If the fuel trailer got hit or ran empty, the crew could jettison it remotely from inside the tank with a quick-release mechanism. It was incredibly effective during the Normandy invasion, and German troops surrendered just at the sight of these things coming. The Churchill Crocodile achieved a 90% success rate in combat across the European theatre, but still got somewhat overlooked. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American troops first used flamethrowers against Japanese forces on a large scale during combat in the Solomon Islands. But it was on Iwo Jima where the Japanese had planned and prepared a completely different fight. General Kuribayashi knew he couldn't beat the Americans on the beaches, so instead he ordered his men to dig in. They took advantage of the island's soft volcanic rock to build a vast underground fortress over 11 miles of tunnels connecting 5,000 caves and 1,500 reinforced concrete pillboxes. These pillboxes had narrow firing slits with overlapping fields of fire, and they were built in zigzag patterns with specialized grenade trenches, so that if a Marine threw a hand grenade inside, the blast would kill 1 or 2 Japanese defenders at best, and then the survivors would reoccupy the position and continue fighting, or hit the American Marines in the back who went past the pillbox they thought was destroyed. Before the Marine landings, the American Navy dropped over 6,800 tons of bombs and fired 22,000 shells from ships over 74 days. And despite all of that, the bombardment only destroyed about 200 of the 1,500 fortifications, while the defenders were waiting underground. The Japanese let the Marines land and pack themselves on the beach without a single shot being fired. They waited for several waves to come, and the beaches to be full of Marines. Then, all hell broke loose. Pre-sighted artillery, machine guns, snipers, mines, they all opened up at once on the Marines lying on the open beach without cover. It was just a slaughter. But despite this, the Marines managed to push inland, although taking enormous casualties, and by the end of the day, they had their foot in the door on Iwo Jima. But the real deal was now just about to begin. It turns out that on this cursed island, conventional weapons were pretty much useless. It was the situation that now made the flamethrower the only weapon that could actually turn the tide of the battle. But getting the flamethrower operator to a position where he could actually fire and take out the pillbox, well, simply put, it was deadly. 94% of flamethrower operators who set foot on Iwo Jima left the island in body bags. And when you take into consideration that he had to sprint across open ground with a 70-pound backpack that the enemy knew all too well what it was, and you add on top of that his effective range of some 20 yards, plus about 10 seconds of firing time, you start to understand that going out on such a mission was pretty much a conscious sacrifice at this point. Because this was so dangerous to do, Marines would play it out like this. A squad of riflemen would stand up on a signal and lay down heavy suppressive fire on the Japanese positions, trying to keep their heads down, while the flamethrower operator ran for dear life from cover to cover across rocky, bombed-out terrain. When he was pretty much in hand grenade range, he could then stand up and fire at the pillbox and take it out. Now he has to go back to safety with his 1911 pistol as his only weapon once the flamethrower is empty. Not to mention what would happen if his flamethrower malfunctioned or he was captured alive. There's an anecdote from Iwo Jima where a flamethrower operator stood in front of a cave entrance and tried to fire inside, but his weapon didn't work. 2 Japanese soldiers sprinted out, grabbed him and dragged him inside the cave. Now, I don't even want to know what happened to him, but it's said that he could be heard screaming from that cave for 2 full days. I'll leave your imagination to do the rest. Besides just spraying the pillbox with an ignited napalm stream, if that wasn't already bad enough for the unfortunate defenders inside, Marines also used a tactic called a wet burst. They'd first spray a pillbox with unlit fuel, letting it drip deep into the ventilation shafts and firing slits, and then fire a second ignited burst to set everything on fire. And this brings us to what actually happens to people on the other side of the napalm stream and how death occurs. So I have to be careful here, but I'll do my best to explain it to you so you can be grossed out the same as I was while researching for this video. So there are several effects of how the flamethrower kills, and the first and most obvious one is through burns. If someone is hit by the burning fuel, you can pretty much imagine what happens. Although, depending on the amount of fuel, it takes about 1 minute for the effects to be lethal, and that minute probably feels like an eternity if you're, being set on fire. Even if hit just by a small splatter of the napalm stream, it will stick to the skin or uniform and continue burning. So horrible burns of various degrees were common for everyone in the proximity of the flamethrower attack. But beyond the direct burns, here is why this weapon is so effective against those pillboxes that couldn't be reliably defeated by any other means. The burning napalm raises the temperature of that enclosed space, and the heat is so intense that it drives up the body temperature of everyone inside. And when the blood temperature shoots past about 43 degrees Celsius, the heart essentially gives out within 30 minutes if you survive the initial blast. Then you have the lungs that are really sensitive to such heat, and inhaling that superheated air would burn them from the inside. They would then react and swell and accumulate fluid, which is not something you'd want in the space you need for breathing. Similar to the World War I chemical weapons that attacked the lungs, the victim would pretty much die of the effects of drowning just from the inside. But the interesting part, if you can call it interesting because it's actually horrifying, is that most of the victims had either minor skin injuries or even none at all, but they all died exactly because of the effects we just explained. And if all of this isn't enough, there is oxygen depletion. meaning that when the napalm stream burns inside the fortification, it almost completely uses up the available oxygen. Anyone in the pillbox would lose consciousness almost immediately after being hit by the flamethrower, but those that survived the initial attack also had carbon monoxide poisoning waiting for them. Up to 10 minutes after the flamethrower attack, that position could be lethal for anyone going into it because of the carbon monoxide. So you've heard all of this horrifying data, but now we'll take a look at perhaps the biggest lie in flamethrower history. During World War II, the US Chemical Warfare Service actually promoted the idea that the flamethrower was a quote-unquote humane or merciful weapon. The argument was that the shock to the nervous system from such intense heat would mean that the victim likely didn't feel the pain at all, and that death came instantly, making it comparable to being shot or hit by any other conventional weapon. However, try selling this to anyone who saw the effects of the flamethrower firsthand, either being the operator or someone on the other side who had seen what happened to anyone that got hit, how it sounded, how they reacted, and perhaps most shockingly, how it smelled. I think that we don't need to go beyond that. This, as you now see, is exactly why the American Marines could win the battle on Iwo Jima, because of flamethrowers. The Marines said themselves that without them, the battle would have had several times greater casualties, or wouldn't have even been won. The Japanese, on the other hand, now knew which weapon to fear the most, but more importantly, which one to take out first, like we said earlier. This, of course, led to those staggering casualty rates of the flamethrower operators, which brings us to the solution for almost every single floor of backpack flamethrowers: the flame tanks. As you heard earlier, those problems of small range, limited fuel capacity, and a bad habit of the flamethrower operator dying within 3 minutes of the battle starting were finally somewhat solved by putting armor around the weapon and giving it tracks to carry more weight. For the Americans, the very first flame tanks were improvised with the M3 light tank, trying it out in the Pacific in the battles leading up to Iwo Jima. So when the M3 Stuart was converted, it got the nickname Satan. It had a range of between 40 and 80 yards and could carry more fuel, but the Stuart light tank was almost obsolete at this point in the war, being just too small and too thinly armoured for such a dangerous job of carrying napalm into battle. When they were deployed in the invasion of Saipan, they immediately showed how effective they could be, so they tried the same thing with the M4 Sherman. This was now a major conversion of a standard Sherman tank through a complicated and expensive process. But the result was a flame tank that could project fire for 130 yards and carry 290 gallons of fuel. There were 3 versions of the Sherman flame tank. The first was where the 75mm main gun was replaced with the flamethrower as the tank's primary armament. This is the one that would be used the most. Then there was the auxiliary type, which had the flamethrower instead of the bow machine gun and kept the tank's main gun. And the third type was the periscope mount, where the flamethrower was installed through the assistant driver's hatch, keeping the bow machine gun. However, this type had a notorious tendency to burn the tank crew if it got hit, making it even worse because some of the hatches were blocked by the fuel tanks. So the Marines didn't want to use it after a few horrific stories of what happened to the crew when the flamethrower was hit by enemy fire. When the Marines landed on Iwo Jima, they had with them 8 of the new Flame Shermans that they quickly began calling simply Zippos. All 8 landed on the first day, but were kept in reserve for the first 2 days of fighting because they were so secret and valuable, so they were deployed cautiously. But once the Marines saw what they could do, they were put into continuous use throughout the whole battle. The Zippo Sherman solved all the problems of the backpack flamethrower, and to make matters even worse for the Japanese defenders, they looked just the same as a regular Sherman from the outside. They couldn't give their undivided attention with everything they could throw at it, like they did with the backpack flamethrower operators. And when the Zippo was in range, surrounded and protected by regular Shermans, and it opened fire, well, it was usually too late to do anything anyway. The Marines quickly became completely dependent on the Flame Shermans, and because there were only 8 of them, they were pooled and dispatched from refueling locations to wherever they were most urgently needed on the battlefield. Every night, engineers were repairing any battle damage they could, and they kept doing that throughout the entire battle. Marines would literally pause their attack and wait for a Zippo to arrive before moving forward. The flame tank would do in 1 hour what a whole tank battalion and 3 infantry companies had been trying to do for a full day. And it wasn't an exaggeration. Napalm mixture was also being dropped from the air by bombers or fighters, and there were a few incendiary bombs created based on it that would be used for burning down Japanese cities. But that's not the topic of of this video. The Japanese were short of heavy artillery and anti-tank guns on Iwo Jima, so they had to come up with creative ways to deal with American armor. And when I say creative, I mean pretty much a one-way mission of one or a few soldiers. The most common method was the satchel charge, or the Type 99 magnetic mine, which a Japanese soldier would throw onto the Sherman tanks. This is how the turret crew of one of those 8 Zippos Shermans was killed when a Japanese soldier detonated himself on the engine deck. But most of the attackers were cut down long before they could reach the tank, and you wouldn't want to charge at a flamethrower tank in particular. This did happen on a few occasions on Iwo Jima and later Okinawa, and, well, you can imagine how it ended. So throughout the battle on Iwo Jima, Zippos Shermans fired 360,000 gallons of napalm mixture. Then the scenario repeated on Okinawa with lessons learned, and this time 54 Zippos Shermans were ready for the invasion. In almost 3 months of continuous combat, the Flamethrower Battalion was credited with over 4,700 Japanese soldiers killed and 49 captured, against losses of 8 killed and 111 wounded. They went through 200,000 gallons of napalm, and although out of 54 flame tanks, 41 were knocked out of action at various points, they brought 26 of them back into service and helped enormously in winning the battle. After both Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the military gave flame tank production its highest possible urgency, the same level assigned to the B-29 bomber and the atomic bomb. This was because the land invasion of Japan was planned, so they had 70 more flame tanks ready when the Japanese finally surrendered. After the war, flame tanks were kept and they saw some action again in Korea. However, the Sherman was now an aging platform, so they took the same idea and applied it to the M48 pattern later, creating the M67, or the pattern Zippo. It held about 100 more gallons of fuel mixture, and over 100 of them were produced and saw combat in the Vietnam War. There was also the M132, the same concept, but now applied to the M113 armoured personnel carrier. These worked in jungle fighting against guerrilla positions and tunnels, and for destroying booby traps in thick vegetation. The North Vietnamese also used Soviet and Chinese-made backpack flamethrowers in a few engagements, when they shocked American Marines by crawling to their bunkers and spraying fire over them. However, the Vietnam War would be the last major conflict where flamethrowers were used against human targets on such a large scale. And this is because of one thing. For the first time, the war was broadcast extensively to the world through television media, and now people could really see what these weapons could do. Of course, the same napalm mixture was also being delivered by air, which made it even more horrific as it was notoriously inaccurate and contributed to many civilian casualties and friendly fire incidents. But the world was changing its opinion on such weapons, and even through that heavily censored and edited news footage, the truth was slowly starting to surface. You've surely seen those famous photos of civilians, villages, and the aftermath of napalm that we can't show you here. So because of the rising public pressure and the flamethrowers becoming less useful outside the specific conditions found on Iwo Jima, they were slowly being put on the shelf. They weren't used on a large scale again after 1978, although ground-launched flamethrowers deployed against legitimate military targets are actually technically legal under international law to this day. And knowing what we humans are like, I wouldn't be surprised if they appear again in some crazy turn of events where they'd once more become effective.